Everybody, welcome to our Learn the Signs Act Early Diversity Echo. Thank you so much for joining us on a Monday afternoon. If you've not taken a minute, please take your put your name and contact information into the chat. We are recording today's session, so by participating in this session, you're consenting to being recorded. We will have this up on our Canvas page as well as on our YouTube recording sessions for ECHO, so you can watch this at a later date as well. If you've not renamed your profile, please take a minute to tell us who you are and where you're from. It helps us know who we can call on and who our colleagues on this call are. We might be talking about some cases that have some sensitive information. So just remember to avoid using any identifiable information. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Bailey if you're unsure of whether that's personal health information. We left that participation, that interactive. So if you have any questions, put those in the chat, raise your hand, let us know how we can help you, as well as if you're interested in sharing about a case. Think about doing a case presentation. They're a great way to learn from our colleagues that are on the call, as well as learn new information. The key components of an ECHO session, if you've never joined one, is we will always try to encourage that community of practice. So sharing what our knowledge is from ourselves to each other. Then we have a didactic speaker, and then we have a case presentation with coming up with some recommendations. Case studies, again, are a great way to hear from everybody about cases that we are struggling with or just want to know some information to take back. If you're interested in doing that, please reach out to us at earlyecho@usu.edu. After today's session, you'll get a email that will have a link to a survey. If you will please take a minute to complete that survey, that's then how we send out our certificates for attendance. Our next session, I'm just going to let you guys know, will be August 8th at 2 o'clock, where we will be talking about CDC's milestones. I am thrilled today to turn the time over to our fabulous colleague from the University of Utah, Dr. Michelle Villalobos, who is going to be talking to us today about health disparities.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Okay, everyone see that okay?
Yep, it looks great.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you all for having me. We really rely on the Learn the Signs Act Early program for a lot of stuff in our clinical work and when we're doing trainings with providers. So I'm excited to be able to spend some time with you and share a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing around healthcare disparities and autism. So please jump in anytime with questions, put them in the chat, just unmute yourself. I hope this can be really conversational and hopefully informative too. I'd like to start by just giving you a little bit of background about myself. So I come from a pretty large Mexican family, and I have a kind of personal story for how I ended up in health equity and autism. And I think a lot of us who end up doing some of this work, whether it's child development or disparities, we all have kind of a reason that we ended up here, and it kind of helps to share that, I think. So this is my cousin Ezra at his high school graduation. He graduated in 2020, which was quite a year to graduate, as you all know. He is now a 22-year-old adult, nonverbal adult with autism. And he did not get diagnosed until he was about 6 years old. So until he hit kindergarten. And I, at the time, was a undergraduate student studying like brain connectivity and autism, and thought I was gonna, go to medical school and be an MD, PhD. And my 2-year-old cousin Ezra walked into Christmas party one day and was flapping and really like having a hard time. And it just kind of hit me that like all the like science in the world is going to take way too long to get him some help. And I kind of pivoted careers at that point and ended up in a clinical psychology program where I could do both research and clinical work. And now I feel like I have 2 jobs, but I love it. And Ezra is the reason that I kind of ended up here. Our family really didn't kind of learn to accept his differences until he got into the school system. And at that point, he was 6 years old and didn't have any words. And I've seen the impact, like all of you have, of early intervention, right? We know that if we get kids talking early, they've got a lot more opportunities in life. So I kind of said, I want to figure out how to make this stuff happen earlier for everybody, right? And I've worked at a lot of different autism centers across the country. And when I worked in places like, the Yale Child Study Center, we were seeing kids at like, even 9 months old, parents are concerned. It was such a different world than where I had come from. And I said, well, we got to even the playing field here. So that's kind of my background and my story for how I ended up kind of here. And I also think we all know that like we've seen it, like especially during the pandemic, it's really highlighted that some of our most vulnerable populations just became more vulnerable and more impacted during the pandemic. So why discuss equity or inequity in autism, right? It seems like a kind of obvious question, but I feel like other people explain it way better than I do. So this is a professor and a person with autism at UNC Chapel Hill who says, racism specifically is inherent in all aspects of life, particularly in the American context though. And by failing to recognize how it impacts our clinical practice or our research, how we build community with autistic adults and families who have children with autism, we continue to fall short with ameliorating the consequences of those systems of racism. So the longer we kind of don't acknowledge that it's happening along the way, the more we see these families impacted and the more it impacts our community and the bigger the disparities get, right? These are just a couple examples of quotes from a really amazing panel that Desi Jones, a researcher at UT Dallas, conducted with autistic adults who are also from an underserved population, to kind of give you a little bit of a personal background. So one person says, at a young age, my doctors never even thought to test me for autism because they weren't looking for autism in someone like me. They were looking for behavioral issues. So I missed out on resources other autistic kids might have received. And then frankly, as a Black and brown Indigenous person, I had bigger fish to fry. I was trying to keep under the radar of the local police, government agencies, who I saw take Black kids away from their parents. So I became an expert camouflager, which was the best way I learned to survive. So I used the very skills that my neurology gave me. I cannot help but wonder now how many young kids like me are out there today using their autistic skills to survive, and as a result are flying under the diagnostic radar. And hopefully, we're better, we're getting better as a field at preventing this from happening, right? But in my practice, mostly I do a lot of autism assessments clinically, and a lot of the kids that I see come in that are a little bit older, they come in with lots of other diagnoses. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on there and how can we sharpen our radar to make sure that our own biases and our own experiences aren't impacting, a child's pathway, most efficient pathway to getting the services they need, whatever they are. So we know that autism occurs now. I think the updated prevalence is 1 in 44, which is kind of mind-boggling. We know that it's more common among boys than girls. A lot of genetic or developmental disabilities do tend to occur more often in boys than girls. But we also aren't very good at picking up autism in girls yet. We'll talk a little bit about that as also a disparity in the field. About 31% on the high end have an intellectual disability. And most children are diagnosed after 4, but that is even later for our racial minority groups. So Black and Hispanic children are diagnosed later. So here's a couple terms that I think are really helpful for us to kind of think about as we go through our own practice and in thinking about where some of the disparities coming from. So this concept of equality is the assumption that everyone benefits from the same exact supports. Meaning that if we just put up this fence and we put up 3 step stools and everyone will be able to see the soccer match. And the fence is normed based on the average person and the boxes are normed on the average person, but we don't ask who's included in that average, right? In autism research, if you go and look at the last 50 years of research, because there's a lot, right? The average research participant is a white male. So almost everything we know about autism comes from the white male research sample. I mean, and we're talking, hundreds of thousands of children and adults in that sample, right? We have some more and more research coming out that is more diverse, including more females and including a more wide variety of racial and ethnic children and adults with autism, but it's taking some time. So we assume that whatever we have found in the autism world applies to everybody is not a good assumption, right? So we can just go ahead and kind of kick that out to the door, right? All we know about ABA really comes from a bunch of white males. Does it work in other, does it work as well for females? I don't actually know that answer. So it could, we just don't know. Equity is the idea that everyone gets the supports that they need. So this is the idea of affirmative action, which ends up resulting in an equity. So, okay, if we need more services for Hispanic families, we'll get some translators, right? Is a translator the same exact thing as having a provider that speaks Spanish with the family? Not really, but does it get that family the service they need? Yeah, so that's equity. Justice is taking away those barriers. What was the root cause of the problem? We don't have enough providers who actually speak Spanish. We're actually not training our minority students really well to stay in the system. If you look at the graduate pipeline, a lot of these students really struggle getting through graduate programs or getting into graduate programs, right? So they can't provide services, right? And supports. So justice is all 3 can see the soccer game without any supports, without the accommodations. Everybody gets to watch the soccer game, right? And that's because that systematic barrier, that actual fence was removed. Does that make sense? So I think this slide really just kind of helps for me kind of bring home that when we start to make these accommodations, those accommodations are great, but we can't forget about hey, we just need to tear the fence down, right? Sometimes you have to, right? Other times you have to work with what you've got. Okay, so this figure is from a researcher, Deonda Stratton, who kind of took this primary care clinical pathway for autism screening and referral and adapted it to say, here are some of the ways that things can break down if racism impacts your pathway. So if you start at the very beginning, caregiver or provider concern. So maybe you have a concern for a family, or a family has a concern about autism. Are we thinking about all the different ways that autism could present itself across racial groups? Or are we thinking about, this is a Black child, he's bouncing off the walls, it's ADHD? Happens all the time, happens at a significantly higher rate than it does for white boys. So that's the first step. And then it goes to developmental surveillance by providers. So how does our own bias, our personal bias, maybe even sometimes dismissal of parent report, impact that surveillance piece that's happening? And then if we think about, okay, well, we have some concerns, but we don't know, we're going to use a screening tool to see if it helps clear things up. And we should do that, right? Anytime we're not sure, like use an MChat, use a POSI, use ages and stages, use a screener, right? We have a lot of them. Almost anybody can administer them and see what happens. But we also have to remember they're not normed, like we talked about, on a diverse group of children, young children and families. They're getting there. They're getting better. The MChat is at least available in 30 different languages or something, which is awesome. But those tools, they might not pick up on some cultural differences, right? And then we move over to referral for testing. And this is where things fall apart most of the time, is that screening and parent concerns to actually getting a referral. And this is where we see a lower rate of referrals among Black and Hispanic children for autism across the board, despite a higher, the same rate of, so a Black child or a Hispanic child might screen positive on one of these measures and still not get referred as consistently as other children. So that's a breakdown. We're gonna figure out kind of what's going on in that referral process, and we don't quite know. We're thinking that that's the provider bias, not really sure, but we need to understand that better. And then you can see this goes all the way through up to service accesses and continuous service access and ongoing navigation of services, right? There's barriers all along the way. And there's some nice examples in the slide for you to kind of look at and, think about, like, where could things be breaking down for a family, any family, right? So here are some places that are really specific opportunities to improve. So this is kind of the diagnostic experience. You see here, like, the time between first discussion of concerns with the provider and age at diagnosis is about 2 years. So a parent might say, I'm a little worried. And then it takes 2 whole years. And this is just on average for them to get a diagnosis. That's so long, right? Part of that's the system. There's long wait lists, but like, what is happening between that first discussion and getting that referral, right? And how can we make sure that gets at least sped up? So right here is that kind of developmental surveillance. You have a proactive provider whose responses resulted in a decrease in age of diagnosis between 1 to 2 years, and that decreased the odds of greater than or equal to 3-year delay in diagnosis by 50%. So this is just saying that if we have more proactive providers, we can move that average age down. And that's huge, right? So it's kind of the story of go for it, refer them, right? And this is really where we see that breakdown. So specifically Black children, but Black and Hispanic children and other minoritized groups, they have a significantly later referral date for getting just into the pipeline, and as a result, a much later diagnosis date, and then a much later service onset date. Okay, so I've kind of thrown these terms around in case it's helpful to see surveillance versus screening. You guys might already know this because you're the you're the early childhood people. But surveillance is that kind of process of just recognizing children who are maybe at risk, right? And then screening is actually when we administer that screener, and then evaluation is that diagnosis to confirm something. So
Michelle,
why do we screen?
Michelle,
Yes, go ahead.
before you put that in there was just one comment, and
Oh, good.
where she said, I think the big breakdown is part of the wait and see mentality with many of the providers in the area I serve. Do you have anything in response to that?
Yeah, I feel like I hear that a lot. Do other folks also kind of see that or experience the wait and see piece? We often wonder like kind of where that comes from, you know, in my own practice. Sometimes it's just a matter of, you know, primary care provider education around some of these early signs, right? And I'm sure you guys experience this a lot in providing like education to providers across the area, the region, right? There's a lot of differences in provider awareness of early signs in some of the more subtle cases too. One of our goals with a grant we have, it's called the Aspire grant, is to try to reach out to those more rural providers that maybe don't have access to a larger medical setting or kind of a larger contingency of resources, to really help them feel as empowered as possible. But that's a big chunk of what you guys do. Do you feel like anyone else have kind of like, you know, thoughts on some of that wait and see piece? Do you feel like there's more there than just education and resources for providers? For some reason, my little chat screen won't pop up. Generational. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. More based on culture. So John, you're saying that like, if a family comes in from a different cultural background, then you're more likely to see providers kind of like be uncertain about it, about referring or moving them on.
I don't mean more so providers, I mean more the family, so the parents. And so, I mean, we can't force them to do anything they don't want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A lot of it is that family education, cultural awareness of autism. Yeah, and stigma. I worked on the Cherokee Reservation in North Carolina for a little while, and there was so much stigma around developmental disabilities and autism that it really impacted a lot of parents who did have some concerns. There'd be a lot of moms who were concerned, but the family unit, you know, wasn't quite on board with it. There's so many different complexities to those barriers. Even if you do have providers who are, you know, on top of it. And I think that's an important piece to remember too, like we, especially in primary care, you know, the best thing we can do for families is to support them in their decisions and give them the best information we can along the way. But if they're not ready, they're not ready. And that's really their choice, right? And to respect that, it can be really hard. Yeah, absolutely.
And thanks for addressing that. That is such a critical piece of that ongoing surveillance. I loved your previous slide right there about the surveillance and the screening, but also just that parent engaged tool. And we're going to talk a lot about that with next time when we talk about the CDC's milestone checklist, but that it's always that ongoing, just like where you said families may not be ready for it. Well, that doesn't mean we stop talking about it. So thank you for addressing that. And thanks everybody for piping in.
Yeah, it's the conversation in that relationship is the most important piece, I think, along the way. It's when they're ready, they're going to need you, right? To support them through that process. And I think every family does reach their own readiness. I saw my cousin really struggle for years, knowing that something wasn't right with Ezra, knowing something was wrong, but being really afraid to face it. And she wasn't ready, but when she was ready, she just tackled it. And he has like the best life now, like she is the strongest advocate for him. She did it in her own time. And yeah, it would have been better if it happened earlier, but she got there, and that's all that mattered. Okay. So these are just a couple gaps that we've seen in our own data in Utah specifically. And I know some of you are not in Utah, but I think it kind of is like more of an example of rural data. Go ahead and open them all. There we go. So some of and this is from some of the ADAM data we have here in Utah. Utah is an ADAM site, which is one of the monitoring sites that contributes to that 1 in 44 rate. So we know that about 2.1% of Utah children have autism, compared with 2.9% nationally. So we know that Utah is probably a little bit behind, lagging on our diagnostic confirmations. Our rural rates, and this was before the 1 in 44 came out, so I probably need to go and update this number. About 1 in 72 children in rural Utah are diagnosed with autism, compared to the state rate of 1 in 54. So that tells us, as we all know, that children in rural areas are underdiagnosed. We're missing kids out there. We have work to do. We know that Black and Hispanic children are diagnosed later, which is greater than 4 years old, and tend to have more intellectual disabilities. And we know that the later you get diagnosed, the less likely you are to have intervention early on, right? So we often see those kind of higher rates of intellectual disabilities as well. And at CDP, where we do our autism evaluations at the U, we have about a referral rate, our referral age is about 5.2, and diagnostic age is about 5.5 for Hispanic children specifically. So, we were talking earlier about some of those care gaps for the Hispanic population. And what we're seeing there is really just kind of a later age of referral, a later age of them getting into the system, and then obviously a later age for everything else kind of comes with that. About 13% of children with ASD living in rural Utah are Hispanic, compared with about 17% statewide. So that just kind of shows you the distribution of where some of these families are. So, you're a minority, racial or ethnic minority family, you're also in a rural area, kind of makes it twice as difficult to access some of those services, right? Get into that system. These are the older numbers from the 2020 data, the 1 in 54 rate, which the disparities haven't changed, but the 1 in 44 has. So we know that among white versus Black children, autism is 1.1 times more likely. Among white versus Hispanic children, it's 1.2 times more likely. And then among Black versus Hispanic, it's 1.1 times more likely. So this kind of really shares the story of autism is underidentified in Hispanic children more so than other racial and ethnic minorities. Our prevalence estimates for Black children have caught up with white children. That just happened in this report here. Thank you so much, Janelle. There's the newest information in the chat box. And what we know though is, although Black children are being identified at the same rate, so we're seeing the same amount of autism in Black and white children with autism in the US, they are actually more likely to access services a lot later. So they may be getting diagnosed, but they're not getting into the service pipeline. Okay. And this is just basically back data a little bit more, blown up. So you can see some different graphs here. Overall, our age of diagnosis is decreasing across all racial and ethnic groups within our ADAM data. So that is good, but there's still a big difference between the Hispanic population. We know that some of the barriers that are contributing to this, they're multi-systemic, right? They come from everything. And we talked a little bit about how the pandemic really kind of it hit the vulnerable populations, and they were already vulnerable, and then it got more difficult, right? More children are being evaluated by 36 months, so that's good. That just isn't happening for our minority families. This is some of the data that I took from CDP. So when I came here 2 years ago now, and kind of took all of our clinical data and said, well, I want to see where our care gaps are. Who are we missing? What's going on with, non-English speaking families, girls, and where can we improve? And I took these service areas, they're kind of designated by HRSA, and looked at age of referral from these areas. And, I'd love to hear kind of your guys' thoughts too. And if this seems right. This is just average age of referral from each of these service areas to us. And we're obviously not the only place that children get diagnosed. But as you can see here, our San Juan and West San Juan age of referral and age of diagnosis are the highest, right? 8 years for, and almost 6 years old for some of our families from these rural areas. Do you guys feel like, you're obviously working with the, the early crew, but do you kind of feel like you see later age of diagnosis for some of these, more rural areas?
Part of the problem for San Juan County is that they don't have access to anything in their county to be diagnosed.
Yeah.
So it requires a pretty significant trip.
Yeah.
And coordination of efforts.
Yeah, and since we have telehealth now, I bet you these numbers have gone down a little bit, I'd hope. But yeah, it takes a huge effort, right? Like, it's so much more work for a family in San Juan to go and get a diagnosis, right? Or treatment. And there's not exactly most of us don't have that kind of like resources or time anyways. So it just adds these barriers. Yeah, it's hard to get an appointment. It is. Yeah. And I think that's one of our hopes through our Aspire grant, is to be able to train primary care providers to be able to diagnose some of these kids that, they just need a diagnosis, right? So they can move on to that next step. Yeah, there's a real shortage of providers too.
Another piece of it is once they get the diagnosis, are there services available in the area too? So what is the real motivation for the families to do it?
Right. What difference is it going to make? If they get an educational classification, that's where the kid is most of the day. They get their services there. That's great, right? They don't necessarily need that medical one, maybe until later when they really do need it for some reason, right?
Yeah, and that that 5.5 and 8 would be when they go into kindergarten.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. Whitney's question about the ADOS. Yeah, so the masking has really complicated our ability to do autism assessments in so many ways, right? Because we're coding facial expressions and social gestures and all these things that you can't see if you have a mask on. And in our hospital setting, masks are required. And I think they will be for who knows how long. And the ADOS is invalid, telehealth or with masks on. So I can administer the ADOS, but I can't report a score. We have other tools that we can use to score, and we can use them over telehealth. So we have a really solid telehealth program going now at CDP. I've had to fight to keep it a bit, but there's so many families from rural areas who are just so grateful for it. And it may not be great for everybody, but we are able to do what's called a CARS and provide a full evaluation via telehealth. And a lot of all centers across the country are doing that now. But the ADOS is the moment is still still on hold. You can administer it, you just can't report a score. Okay, well, let me see here. So this is another pathway example where you can kind of see here, and this is from Dr. Katie Wallace at CHOP, who is a really incredible healthcare disparities and autism researcher and a pediatrician. She kind of goes through that initial child concerns through screening, and then what happens after the positive screen. And then you can see over here, that's the referral piece, that 1 in 4 providers do not refer following a positive screen. So it kind of begs that question we were talking about, what's happening with that referral piece, right? So why don't those minority children get referred as frequently? And that's something we have to kind of think through. But just knowing that that's a breakdown is important, because then we can, talk to parents or talk to providers, or, make sure we're checking in on that part of the process, because it's more likely to fall apart. And that's true for everybody. It's just more true for our minority families. All right, so the thing that does tend to happen that we see a lot is and some more of these kind of care gaps is that misdiagnosis or that missed diagnosis. So diagnosis often occurs well after that 4-year-old age range, after parents have a concern. And this for Black children in particular. There was a recent study that was published out of Seattle from University of Washington. Dr. John Constantino and his group took this data set that was actually looking at brain scans and stuff, and looked at just the Black children in that, and found that parents had a concern 42 months before their children were diagnosed. And what we saw in that earlier slide was that it's about 24 months for the average kid, but for Black children it's almost twice as long, right? So if it takes 2 years on average for a kid to, for a parent to have a concern and to get a diagnosis, it's taking twice as long for a Black kid from the time that parent has a concern. That's a really long time, right? So that has so many trickle down effects, not just for the kid and the kid's health and access to services and everything, but it also increases financial and material burdens, right? So we really need to make sure it's not just these systematic physical barriers, whether it's rurality or distance, but our own provider bias, right? That is impacting that referral from happening, right? We know that parents of Black children are more likely to have concerns about communication during an autism diagnosis. So that's one important piece for providers to think about. That communication piece. Black parents might be more concerned about communication. That's a red flag. Say, okay, that's related to a later autism diagnosis. I should follow up on that. And that's a very tiny piece of all the cultural and systemic barriers that are happening, that are often out of our control. But just being aware of some of these things that we do know exist can go a really long way, right? Let's see, Sherry has a question. Data shows that referral from drops before or after a negative positive screen, or even maybe Sherry, you can explain your question a little more so make sure I understand it.
Sorry, hi. I was just confused when you say that the referrals drop for minority children. Is that after, I'm just trying to understand, is that after a parent or caregiver goes to a doctor and says, hey, I have concerns, and the doctor's not following? I'm just trying to understand where the referrals are dropping off.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Sherry. We're also not totally sure what kind of what's going on right there, right? Like, we know that, like, for whatever reason, only 1 in 4 children are being referred after a positive screen, but we don't exactly know why. Like,
Okay,
why
so
are
that's kind of
providers
what I was trying to
hesitating?
understand was I didn't understand where it was coming from. I was like,
Yeah.
okay, how do
Yeah,
I
I
just
would
didn't
love to know
understand,
too.
that's all. I mean, I know in our area, we don't have much of a minority community except for the Native community.
Yeah.
But a lot of times that's just not understanding development of their child, or just not getting that information on the reservation for whatever reason. A lot of times I find with my families.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. We talk a lot about, because we're providers, you know, what our provider biases or what providers are doing wrong. But like, maybe, like we talked about before, maybe the family's not ready, right? And the provider knows that. And if they push it, right, despite there's being a positive screen, they're going to lose that family or their trust or that rapport. And that's an
I
important-
can agree with that. I have to also add that I'm a mother of an autistic boy, and when my son was diagnosed, I can tell you that those doctors were not shy about letting me know exactly. And this was in North Carolina when you were talking about, I was trying to say if I knew that doctor, but they were very upfront with me, and I was happy about that. But I've been in situations where I guess they just really treated parents with, you know, real kid gloves or whatever, just real gentle. And I think that just varies on the family. But I'm pretty blunt with how I handle families with children that I suspect may have that. I'm like, I've been there, and I'm not gonna be gentle about it, because I think you need to know it now and kind of get used to it, because if this is what it is or anything like it, you know, you're gonna have to, because that kiddo is going to need you. And so you got to kind of get your strength up now. I'd rather do it then than, you know, wait. I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, I think that you're right. Every provider is a little bit different for sure, and how they, you know, handle parents and families. And it's hard to make a blanket statement for like, this is how it should be done. Right. But yeah, that variability could really contribute to that 1 in 4, right? Yeah, and I hear a lot from families who say, I wish the provider would have just said something or been straightforward with me. And maybe not every family's like that, but I think that hindsight piece really probably kicks in.
Obviously, I wouldn't say that to a family that just has, you know, a speech delay. Obviously, in chat, or there's something, you know, some stimming behavior. There's something that just really has. Okay, I'm not a diagnostician. However, I feel that, you know, characteristics are likely. Then I will be a little bit more pushy, just because, you know, it's a whole different mindset to go from, especially if they have another child, to raising a, you know, a typical developing child to one that doesn't. So I just feel like I want them to be prepared. Maybe that's just mine because it was how I felt, but it's just a scary thought to not have them prepared, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're on the other side of it, and you know what they're up against. Yeah, and that's nice that you can provide that perspective as a parent to a parent. You know, I think that goes a long way, longer than I think any healthcare provider. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts on kind of the like screening and kind of referral stuff before I move on to what comes after that? Well, if you think of any, just toss them in the chat or jump in. One of the projects that I've been working on with a program called The Color of Autism is trying to document the experiences of Black families with autism, and trying to educate researchers, providers, the autism community around it's more than, you know, just like it's more than just racism, but racism is really all of it. And what is that family's experience along the way, and what do families perceive as their own barriers? So for Black families in particular, there's a lot of mistrust in the medical institution, and for very good reasons that some of us may be, very aware of, and others may not have a lot of knowledge about. And that's okay, right? Like, it's all about getting that knowledge. So for Black families, when we're thinking about what some of those kind of cultural barriers might be, we can think about, what are some of the things that have happened in the research and medical community for Black families a long, long time ago, right? You can think about the history of bell hooks, and you can think about how a lot of, adult Black men and women were used for research in ways that were now not ethically considered okay, right? So there is a distinct experience for a Black family accessing medical care, let alone accessing medical care for their child and thinking about autism. So the cultural experience, when we think about it as just interpreting development differently is one thing, but then also thinking about it as the cultural experience of, interacting and interfacing with the medical institution, right? And we talk a lot about with Latina families, that distrust as well, but it comes from a different place, right? In Mexico, you don't have like a primary care provider that you talk to about your healthcare a lot. Like, that doesn't really like exist. The institution of healthcare there is very different than it is here. So thinking about how we interface and interact with families and where they're coming from, and every family will think about this stuff differently, right? It's really, really important. So this was a paper we published in the International Journal of Autism, really just talking to families about their experiences. And it's free. You can access it if you want to. It just has some different perspectives in there. So that's one kind of perspective that I wanted to share with you all. In terms of just resources for families that are coming from different cultural backgrounds, there's a couple really good ones that I like to share. Obviously, I've talked about the Color of Autism a lot. They're not for profit that works with families, mostly Black families, but really will, include any family. They have parent support groups, parent training groups, all kinds of resources, and they're, international because it's mostly virtual now. Autism Speaks is great for some things, not great for other things. One of the things that they are great for is they happen to have lots of things translated. So non-English resources is a whole page they have that is super, super handy. Highly recommend that one. And then They Love Families is this wonderful program based out of Austin, Texas, for English and non-English speaking families, but they work primarily with Hispanic families, and have all of their providers speak Spanish. And if you have a family that just needs to talk to somebody about autism in Spanish and like connect them with some support groups of Spanish speaking families, they're my go-to. And they're wonderful. Their founder, Maria Hernandez, started this, like 10 years ago. She comes from a family with multiple different kinds of disabilities and is just super passionate about like getting resources out there for all those transition points that families go through. And then, thinking more about kind of other sort of minority groups, if you will, we very rarely now see children with really severe or profound autism. So a lot of the resources out there are for pretty verbal children. For those of you who work in communities, rural communities, children who get diagnosed later, you're going to see this more. So there are supports and parent support and advocacy groups out there for children who have profound or severe autism. Okay, and I am going to share a video with you. Any questions as I kind of get the video ready to go here? Or any thoughts?
the memory and the spirit of historical trauma and the story of Emmett Till.
Let me get it bigger. Everyone see it okay? All right. I'm gonna back her up. So this is Kim Kaiser. She is a parent of a teenager, a Black teenager with autism. And I wanted to just have her share her perspective as a Black mother of a child with autism, because I think it's a really, really great and elegant way to talk about it.
Black autistic mother, words of a Black mother of an autistic adolescent, who I think speaks to the fierce urgency of now.
I can start with, what does it mean to be a Black mother, period? So for us as parents, there is always an anxiety. I like to say that the feelings, the memory, and the spirit of historical trauma and the story of Emmett Till just lies within our womb, within our soul in the Black community. The fear of a Black mother. I mean, I always say Black folks are not allowed to be unapologetically themselves. They are not permitted to be neurodiverse. And we know this on a lot of levels. So my biggest fear is if an officer approaches my child and my child begins to stem, have to put his hands in his pocket to take out one of the little things he likes to hold on to help him with his anxiety. He's got one of his little trinkets or things that he holds on to and reaches into that pocket to pull it out to calm himself. What's going to happen to my son?
Okay. Any thoughts on kind of Kim's story? You know, I think the Black community in Utah is much smaller than our Hispanic community, but I also think that it's a really important perspective for us to have. And she just so eloquently describes like her own thought process and her own anxieties a lot, as we have parents on here who are often worried about what's going to happen with their kids when they go all kinds of different places, right? And to layer this extra stress on is a lot to ask of parents. So the question is, how do we support our families through this, right? How do we equip them to feel prepared to handle any of those situations, right? And it'll be different for every family, but thinking about some of the unique ways that it's different for some of our Black and Hispanic families is important. Switch slides here. Okay. You might have already seen some of these resources around, but these are just some resources for our own like provider, you know, our own personal bias training stuff. So there's this implicit bias test that you can take for free that is super illuminating to do. It takes like a couple minutes. You can do it online. And, you know, simply incorporating things like, you know, what's preventing me from, you know, making the referral or having this conversation with this family. And that's a good question for us to have all the time, like regardless of what we're thinking about, you know, what is it me? Is it something for me? Like, what is my instinct telling me right now why I should or shouldn't have this conversation or provide this resource? What's the part of me that's stopping it? So those are just some resources. And then this is part of a larger training that I'm doing through our Autism ECHO Series. It's an Autism 101 ECHO Series. And as part of that, I kind of go through each of these kind of pieces of the cycle. And there's no real one place to start. When we're starting to like say, okay, I want to make a more intentional effort of thinking about disparities and inequity in the work that I'm doing. What am I missing? What are my own biases? How can I be just better? And all of these like different places within the cycle are great to start. You know, we start usually in our series with understanding the gaps and then moving all the way back up to that. And it's kind of an ongoing cycle that we we go through as professionals, as humans, I think, in thinking about our own personal growth and our own kind of education. And because I'm a researcher, a big part of that is like collecting the data. Like, let's look at the numbers, right? Like when I came to UDAC, I was like, we're going to look at the numbers. We're going to see who's getting in the door. We're going to see who's not getting in the door. And then we got to figure out how to even that out, right? And having that honest conversation with ourselves. So that is all I have for you today, but I'm happy to kind of talk through some of this. I know I was supposed to leave 10 minutes for questions. I think I left 5. I'll let you take over, Janelle.
Well, that's great. It leads to some great discussions that I think need to happen. My first one is, what can we as early intervention providers do, or early childcare providers do, to help support bridge some of those gaps or those disparities? I'd love to hear everybody's answers, or your answers on that too, Michelle.
It's sometimes overwhelming to think about, right? And we think about how there are so many barriers for, just your average family to get a diagnosis, right? Then you pile on all of these things that are, some of them super foreign to us, lives that we don't live. And it's like I don't even know where to start. So I will often say to providers, just pick like a teeny tiny thing. Something you can do that, is like a starting point. And like, usually when we used to do trainings in person, I would have everyone write it down on a little index card and like share it around the group. And sometimes it's, take the implicit bias test, or, like rethink, some of those ADHD, or inattention kids that I've been seeing, or like, just be more aware of my referral process, right? Like something small that doesn't feel too overwhelming, because as someone who like studies this day in and day out, I can tell you that like you go too deep and you're like, well, there's just nothing I can do. Like, the whole system is broken. And that's not true. There's so much we do on a daily basis that's important. So I don't know if that helps, but that's my two cents. Pick something teeny tiny.
No, that's a good point. I like that idea of doing the implicit bias one. I'm going to call on someone only because I know that he's been working on this. So Jordan Thomas, you're on my screen. So tell me, what is one thing that, as you're working with families of different cultures, how do you go about supporting them?
Yeah, that's a really great question, but it's also a really big question, is supporting families from different cultures. Like Janelle said, we work with lots of different families from lots of different cultures, specifically Hispanic, Latinx cultures, as well as Somali, Marshallese, from all over, and from very many different cultures. And I think the biggest thing is just making sure that communication is as clear as possible, be that through interpretation if needed, but like was mentioned earlier, that's maybe not always the best option, but for a lot of us, that's the only option we have at this point. And so just making sure that communication is 100% clear on both ends, not just the provider giving the information, but getting that feedback from the family. I think that's been one of the biggest ones that I've caught, at least with my caseload personally, is if I get a transfer from a different provider or a different program and they get into it and we start talking about things, a lot of the time they will report, I don't remember having this type of conversation with the previous provider. I don't remember this being brought up. And a lot of the times they feel like a lot of these decisions were made without their consent or without them really understanding and fully understanding. So I feel like that biggest thing is that communication. But again, that's a huge portion to everything that we do, but it's also a really big stumbling block, I guess is a word for it, but just not being able to always have the provider that has that language or those cultural skills for that specific family, because even from families from these different cultures, their specific family culture is going to be different from everybody else, just like everyone is their own unique person. Every individual family unit is going to be unique and different. And so I think the best way is just communicate and then get to know the family unit and the family culture and figure out what's going to work best for them and how the best way to communicate with them is going to be, and the best thing that you can do as a provider or as a interventionist or someone that's going into their home, what best you can do to fit into their family unit, not just add more to it, but fit into that to where you're helping and supporting that family.
I really love that. Yeah, I think communication is really everything. And it seems simple, but it's so nuanced.
It's a huge one too. The other thing that, Michelle, from your talk was just that when you were talking about the Latinx population, where they in Mexico perhaps don't have a healthcare provider or a family care physician. And people are going to probably now start saying, I don't want to know Janelle, because I'm going to call out on Crystal, because Crystal, it reminded me of maybe the polygamy culture that you guys live by. Do you notice disparities within them as well?
Hang on a second. Let me turn up my volume. Okay. Will you say that again? My volume was so low I couldn't catch it all.
Well, so I was assuming that probably your culture of the polygamy that you live down by probably has that same aspect of that they don't always go to a primary care physician, or they may be nervous about that. So what are some things that your program does to help support that population with health disparities?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue that we run into, and I don't know if Heidi's on here, but is that like there's a home birth, or they use natural, I don't know, what do you call it? Holistic medicine and stuff. And so they're not going to like a typical pediatrician. A lot of the local providers there in town are those type of providers, or they'll use a chiropractor or somebody else. And so, yeah. And I think mostly what we do is just try and meet them where they're at and respect their family culture and their decisions, and then move forward as we can. And for some, I would say for several families, sometimes it's our second child that we have with them. And sometimes it's close to exit when we're talking about transition that they decide to, look into things further. But it's also difficult, I think, when you have a family that has a family history of children with the same sorts of delays, and they're not concerned. And I don't know that it's specific to this population, but they're just not concerned because none of the other kids talked until they were 4. And so they know that they're going to turn out okay in the end, or whatever. And so there are some of those things that play into it too. But like, I think the most that we can do is just, just like he was saying, give them as much information as they can, help them make informed, consensual decisions, and respect where they're at.
And kind of create that safe environment for them that like no one wants to feel shamed or judged, right? And kind of keeping our own opinions about, whether we agree with how somebody's living or raising their children, right? And I can imagine as early intervention providers, that is probably a big chunk of your mental energy already. These are kind of the harder ones to, yeah.
So we try and keep the same providers that already are trusted in the community, whether that be, our Hispanic community or otherwise, but and then if we can help the parents network with each other, then sometimes some of those scary things become a little bit more commonplace and not so scary.
So I have other questions if somebody wants to take a minute though to ask Michelle questions. My other question for everybody on this call, I just think we can learn from how other people are being successful or struggling with it. So my question is if you have a family that says we don't have autism or developmental delays in our population, how would you respond to that? So Shelby. Clark.
Hey, sorry, I lost my mouse. I feel like that's hard because I would want to clarify what they mean. Like, do they just not believe in it? Do they not believe that it's a true thing? Yeah, I would need clarification, I feel like.
So maybe clarification from where they're from or clarification of what their thoughts are?
I think both.
Like, what does autism mean to them? Like, what is it
Right.
supposed to look like in their eyes?
Right.
Michelle, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, we often talk about, you know, trying to understand what the concerns are and treating those concerns and worrying less about the label, right? And talking about how the label is kind of a pathway to getting that support, right? If, you know, there's elopement is an issue, right? And getting somebody in there to support with a behavior plan to reduce that, you know, really dangerous behavior. Can go a long way. It's so hard with the label of autism now in so many different ways and interpretations. It's really is a challenge to have that conversation.
Yeah, and some ways to go about doing it for sure with that. Anybody else have any thoughts on that question?
I've had some success with my families. I think it depends on how you present the information. If you tell a family that you're going to label their child, that's exactly how they're going to see it. If you explain what autism is and other developmental disorders, that it's just a different way that brain works. It's not that it works faulty or that it is wrong or that something is wrong with their child. It's just their brain receives and processes information different, and we've got to figure it out how we can get the information to that child so that they can learn like other children typically do. I found a few books that work handy that are good for me and my families, and I always refer, sometimes I refer to the parents if they don't really believe that whole my kid is not delayed, to that CDC milestone tracker. Just because I find that if a parent, and also myself, when my kid was being diagnosed, if I see the problem in my kid and I say it's different than if some strange person walks in a room and tells me after seeing my kid for 5 minutes, well, your kid does this, and doesn't do this, and this. It makes me feel like more attacked, I guess, at my parenting or what my child is, because it's my creation. You know what I mean? It's what I made. So I think when a parent comes to either the early interventionist or the provider with their concerns that they've seen from something that's reliable like CDC, it has them feel a little bit more comfortable because they're the one that's bringing that awareness to the problem and not somebody else that they may not know.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love all these discussions, and you guys always have great answers. So that's why I always love to rack your brains and hear from it. Another question that I'm going to pose in just helping with some disparities is, how do you help a family or a medical care or an early child care professional when they discount some of those behaviors because of a cultural, they're not sure if it's part of their culture. So for instance, maybe it is the lack of joint attention or joint referencing, but we kind of shoo it away because they're from a population that we're not sure of. How do you guys handle that? or thoughts?
I guess one of my first places to look would be ask the family how their culture would react to that type of behavior. In my culture, we may, I don't know, whatever, corrective behavior by doing this, but so some of the native tribes here, they handle their discipline different. So I think I would just ask the family, how does your culture handle it? And how do you feel that would be the best way to handle it in respect to your culture? That's what we're here for, is to kind of learn what's best for the family in the first place. So I think that's what I would firstly do.
Yeah, do you guys notice that maybe they get where Dr. Villalobos was talking about those disparities in screenings? Do you think that the screenings don't pick up some of those things from different cultures, or because of that?
I guess I'm going to open my mouth again. Sorry. I find it here, they do, because of some of my screeners, they ask about like electronic devices and how the child reacts to certain social situations that don't occur in some of the communities that are on our reservations where I live. So it's difficult to talk to a family about, some question on a screener that their child cannot, and I can't relate it to them at all. I can't say, okay, well, instead of standing on his tippy toes, will he reach, will he stretch to get out of reach of something? I can't do that with a cultural difference. So sometimes I get frustrated and I wish they were a little bit, not want to say vague, but just open to any family with any child, and not just families that have means to provide electronics. So not just, by race, but even by just social standpoint, a lot of families don't have electronics that their kids can play or that they have the freedom to use.
It's like the birthday party on the ADOS, right?
Yeah.
That's part of the ADOS. And I'm like, okay, well, how many kids have never, ever experienced a birthday party because their parents do not do that? Because their religion doesn't believe in it, or because they just don't, there's certain things that are incorporated into our assessments and our curriculums that are exclusive.
Mhm. Yeah, again, it
I'm
goes
just gonna
back to
say
that
that-
norming thing, right? Like they were all designed for and developed and tested and validated on a really specific population that excluded a lot of people, including, like gender, race, culture, all of it. Yeah. We have a lot of work to do.
Shelby, you were going to say something.
I was just gonna say that reminded me of, there's a family that I work with, and of course, now that I'm thinking about them, I can't think of which culture they're from. I see them on like a quarterly basis, I think. But the parents still spoon feed their almost 3-year-old because of, cultural, that's just what they do. So you think about all these screeners that ask, is your child using utensils? Well, no, because that's not what we do in our culture. So it just kind of, I don't know, it just made me think of that.
Yeah, kind of as we're all thinking about that, it certainly brings up all those, all of the tools that we use, and are we paying attention to cultural norms or ethnicity or race, and how we go about addressing those.
That's from a different culture, and I have had, when my children are being assessed, have somebody just frankly ask me, do you think this is part of your family culture or whatever or not? And it's a little awkward, but it's helpful, it gives the parent the chance to answer whether or not, yes, this is totally a cultural thing, or no, it's not. Doesn't have anything to do with it,
Yeah.
So I kind of have a question about when you are approaching different cultures, as somebody that hasn't really come from any kind of specific culture, except for maybe like Southern raising, is it how do you like to be asked in respect to your culture? Because I never want to offend anyone. But I want to make that parent aware that I understand and I'm aware of the difference. And I want to make this as comfortable and as excessive to you as I would any, a child of my own race or gender or whatever. So I just don't know how to be respectful about that sometimes when approaching it.
So I'm opening it up to everybody because I think you guys have the great answers from that. It looks like, John, you unmuted.
Yeah, I was thinking about it and now I'm second guessing myself. But I was thinking that you could ask them if this is something they grew up with, if this is something that was in their family when they grew up, where they grew up, and it kind of gives you an inside look into how their family culture was. And you could ask them, okay, well, would you label this as something part of your culture? And then they could say yes or no. Or you can say, oh, it was mainly just with my family. Okay, well then we can go with that. We can work with something that you've grown up with or something that the spouse grew up with. I guess just kind of leading into those questions instead of just blatantly saying, hey, what's your culture?
I agree. Yeah, I hate to say, like, even just saying like, what's your culture? Or what does your culture do? I feel like I'm putting a separation between me and you. And so I usually ask, what did your parents do when you were little? What did, there's ways to let them fill you in without making that separation. And then you have to glean what would be appropriate and what you'll just shine because that won't apply. Does that make sense? It's just a feeling, like it's a relationship builder.
Yeah, all great points of it. Anybody else have any thoughts or ideas?
I think what everybody's said so far has been awesome, and I'm actually going to start implementing some of these ideas. I love this, but I think for me, it's almost a little bit easier to start those conversations and have those because I am a male coming into their home, and a lot of times, a lot of the families are a little uncomfortable with that right up at the beginning. Just saying, hey, I'm coming to your home. I'm going to be working with your infant or toddler who is younger than 3 years old. And a lot of people are a little bit nervous about that, hearing that an adult male is coming into my home to work with my toddler. That's a little scary for some people. And so almost every initial visit for me is a little bit awkward with just addressing those things and addressing those. And then where it is already a little bit awkward, if you just kind of treat it as something that's normal, that happens all the time, it might feel a little awkward and a little uncomfortable, but just clarifying that this is helping me better get to know you guys and understand your family unit and your family culture. That's going to help me help your child, help me help you help your child. It's kind of a long street there, but that's just going to be the best way to do it, is just be upfront with them, as clear as and concise as you can possibly be, and just building on commonalities as well. It's just saying, oh yeah, like if you did this when you were younger, like I remember when I would have fun and do this. And you don't have to go into crazy detail. You can just build on something that's small and common, build on that so that they can build a little bit of that trust and that rapport with you as a provider or as an interventionist, and just let them also see that you're human too, that you're not just someone that's coming there to go through the checklist, go through the screener, go through whatever it is, but to relate to you as well and build that rapport, I think is huge.
Yeah, those are all great points. So I know that was a different case presentation than what, if you've ever joined an ECHO before in the past, that was different than what we've ever done, but it was a great way to hear how other people kind of work on engaging families and understanding or learning from each other where some of the things that we see in disparities are. So thank you very much for participating in that and joining that. But on that note, if anybody does have a case of a particular family that they would like to bring up, please feel free to reach out to us and let think about sharing that next week. Next week, we are meeting again, and we'll be talking about the CDC's milestones and the revised milestones, some reasons why that was changed. So hopefully to see you guys next week at the same time. And I'll be sending out the PowerPoints, Canvas invite, as well as a link to the survey. So thank you so much for your time and participation.